The contract had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper worn thin at the corners like something handled by nervous hands over a very long journey. Wren Holt smoothed it against her knee for what she told herself was the last time, her eyes moving over the words she had already memorized, not because she needed to read them again, but because reading gave her hands something to do while the wagon wheels turned beneath her and the land stretched out in every direction, vast and indifferent, and nothing like anything she had known before. She had read the advertisement twice before answering it. She was not a woman who acted without thinking. She had been careful her whole life, careful and steady and sensible. And look where that had gotten her. $11 in a small cloth purse tucked inside her coat. A single traveling bag wedged between her feet. A contract with a stranger's name printed at the bottom in plain, dark ink. Garrett Voss. Voss Ranch. A destination she could not picture and had spent 3 weeks trying not to picture, because the imagining was worse than the not knowing. The wagon hit a rut and swayed, and Wren pressed her hand flat against the seat to steady herself. The driver did not apologize. He had not spoken much since morning, which suited her fine. She was not in the mood for conversation. She was in the mood for arrival, for the particular relief of having something finally be over. She had not noticed the clause until this morning. That was the part she kept returning to, the part that sat in her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. She had been standing in weak early light outside a roadside stop, rereading the contract for the 10th time as the wagon was being readied, when her eye caught a line she had skimmed past before. The contracting party reserves the right to dissolve this agreement no fewer than 30 days prior to the date of arrival. She had read it twice. Then she had counted backward from today, standing in the cold with the paper shaking slightly in the wind, and she had understood immediately what it meant, and immediately that it changed nothing, because she had already been moving for 2 hours, and there was nowhere to go but forward. $11 did not take a person backward. It barely took a person forward. She put the contract in her coat pocket and kept her eyes on the road. The wagon crested a low rise, and the driver said nothing, but Wren felt the shift in his posture and looked up. The ranch appeared below like something settled into the landscape rather than built upon it, as though the land had always held the shape of it, and the buildings had simply grown to fill the space. A long, low house with a covered porch running the full length of the front. A barn behind it, solid and weathered, the wood gone silver with years of sun and wind. Fenced pastures spreading out on both sides, the grass pale and dry in the autumn light. A water trough. A woodpile stacked with the methodical care of someone who understood that winter was not a possibility, but a certainty. And beyond all of it, hills rolling toward the horizon in layers of amber and brown and a blue so faint it was nearly gray. It was not beautiful the way she had imagined beautiful things in the years when she still imagined them. It was something harder than beautiful, something that had endured long enough to stop needing to be anything other than what it was. Wren straightened her back and looked at it and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the uncertainty and the cold that had settled into her bones over 3 days of traveling, something she had not expected to feel. Not hope, exactly. Not yet. Something quieter than hope. The faint, cautious recognition that a place could hold a person, if the person was willing to be held. The wagon stopped at the gate, and there he was. Garrett Voss stood at the fence post with one hand resting on the weathered wood and the other at his side, holding an envelope. He was taller than she had expected, taller and stiller, the kind of still that was not laziness but its opposite, the contained readiness of a man who spent his days in physical work and had learned to conserve everything that wasn't necessary. He wore clothes that had been worn and mended and worn again, that had shaped themselves to the particular way he moved. His face was weathered, the lines around his eyes deep from years of squinting into sun and wind, and his expression was the expression of a man confronting something he had not adequately prepared for. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they had hoped would solve itself, and now must solve themselves. Wren did not move immediately. She sat for a moment and looked back at him across the distance of the gate, and in that moment she noticed two things. She noticed that the envelope in his hand was sealed and addressed but bore no travel marks on it. It had never been sent. And she noticed that when he saw her looking at it, he did not put it away. He held it at his side, and he held her gaze, and neither of them spoke, while the driver climbed down from the bench with the slow, deliberate movements of a man whose back hurt, and who was not going to rush for anyone. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. The ground was harder than she expected, packed earth that had not seen rain in some time, and the air carried the smell of dry grass and cold dust and something faintly medicinal she could not immediately name. She picked up her bag herself because the driver was already untying it from the back, and she saw no reason to stand and wait for him to carry it when she had two good hands. She walked to the gate. Garrett opened it without speaking, and she stepped through, and they stood perhaps 4 feet apart in the thin autumn light, with the hills behind him and the traveled road behind her, and the space between them full of everything that had not yet been said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Miss Holt." His voice was low and measured. He glanced at the bag beside her, then back at her face. "You made it." "I did." He looked at the envelope in his hand. She watched him decide something, watched the decision move through him the way weather moves across open land, visible from a distance, and then suddenly present. "I wrote to you," he said, 3 weeks ago. I said that the arrangement was that I had changed my mind about it. About this." He paused. "I should have sent it sooner. I meant to send it sooner." Wren waited. She had learned in the years of her life that had required it, that waiting was often the most useful thing a person could do. "The letter didn't reach you," he said. It was not a question. "If it had," she said quietly, "I wouldn't be standing here." He looked at her steadily. There was no cruelty in his face, no impatience, no satisfaction at having the better position in this particular set of circumstances. There was only the weariness that belonged to a man who had been making difficult decisions alone for a long time, and had discovered no method that made them easier. He opened his mouth. She could see the shape of what was coming. The careful, fair-minded words of a man trying to do the right thing by a woman he did not know and had not intended to summon to his door. She could hear the apology already forming in the air between them, and she could hear, beneath it, the thing the apology would lead to. And she was already calculating what $11 would buy, and how far it would take her, and what would be on the other side of that distance. And then she heard it. A sound from inside the house, small and dry and rhythmic. Not a single cough, but a series of them, each one a little harder than the last, the kind that came from deep in the chest rather than the throat, the kind that woke a person in the night and left them exhausted by morning. A child's cough. She recognized it the way she recognized the particular quality of silence before a storm, not because she had been told what it meant, but because something in her simply knew. She looked past Garrett toward the house. Through the nearest window she could see the pale rectangle of a bed, and in the bed a small shape beneath a quilt that had been pulled up to chin level. The shape was very still, except for the coughing, and then it was still again. Wren looked back at Garrett. His jaw had tightened in the way that jaws tightened when a person was holding something in. His eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment, somewhere private and complicated, before he pulled them back to her face. "Who is that?" she asked. "That's Della." He said the name the way people said the names of things that worried them, things they had been worrying about alone and had not found a way to stop worrying about. Her father worked the ranch. He passed in the spring. She's been here since. "How long has she been sick?" A pause. Not the pause of a man who did not know, but the pause of a man who was aware that the answer did not reflect well on him. 3 days. Wren looked at the window. The shape beneath the quilt had gone still again, the way children went still between coughing fits, not resting, exactly, but enduring, conserving what little energy the fever had left them. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her coat, then the second. She pulled the coat off and folded it over her arm, and she looked at Garrett Voss with the calm, level attention of a woman who had made her decision and did not need him to confirm it. "Show me where the kitchen is," she said. "I'll need water heating as soon as possible. Clean cloths if you have them. The older the better, something soft. Whatever you keep in your medicine box, bring it to me and let me see what's there." She glanced toward the house. "Does she have a name for me to call her?" "Della," he said again. "Then let's go see Della." He stared at her for a moment with an expression she did not have time to interpret. Then he turned and led her inside. The house was plainer than she had imagined and considerably cleaner than she would have expected from a man living alone in working country. The front room held a wooden table, 2 chairs set at angles to a fireplace, and a low fire that had been laid with practical efficiency rather than any thought for its appearance. A small shelf on the wall held 3 books and a tin cup and a folded piece of cloth. Everything in the room had a place, and everything was in it. This was the organization not of a tidy person, but of a solitary one. Someone who needed to find things in the dark and could not afford the cost of disorder. The kitchen was narrow and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. A cast iron stove along one wall, a pump over a deep basin, shelves holding provisions and the methodical arrangements of a person who restocked deliberately and used carefully. A row of hooks near the back door held a work coat and a length of rope and a lantern. One hook at the far end was empty. It had the particular emptiness of something recently removed rather than never filled. Della's room was off the kitchen, small and low-ceilinged, with a single window facing east and curtains the color of old cream that let in the light, but softened it to something gentler than the morning deserved. The bed had an iron frame, the bars of it cool and dark, and in the bed was the child. She was 7 years old, or near enough to it, small for her age, or perhaps only seeming so because sickness made everything smaller, compressed everything down to its most essential form. Her hair was dark and spread against the pillow, damp at the edges from the fever. Her face was flushed with the color that lived between discomfort and danger, the color that asked to be watched carefully and responded to quickly. Her eyes were closed. Wren sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead. Hot. Not at its worst yet, but climbing. And it had already been climbing for 3 days. She reached for the girl's wrist and held it gently, feeling the pulse, quick and light, the way a fever pulse always was, the body working too hard at the wrong things. She looked up at Garrett, who stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and his face doing the complicated thing it had been doing since she arrived. He was watching Della with an expression that held more than concern. Something older than concern, something that had been living in him for a long time and had found, in this small, sick child, a place to attach itself. He stood at the threshold and would not come in. And Wren understood without being told that this was not because he did not care. It was because he cared in a way that cost him something to be near. "Willowbark," she said, keeping her voice quiet and practical, the voice she used when the situation called for steadiness. "If you don't have it, tell me what's in the box and I'll see what can be made to work. And the water. I need it hot." He left without a word. She heard the pump working in the kitchen, heard the stove being stoked, heard the particular careful sounds of a man moving with more attention than usual, handling things more gently than the objects themselves required. It was its own kind of language, and she noted it without making anything of it yet. She turned back to Della. "Hello," she said softly, though the girl was not fully conscious. "My name is Wren. I'm going to sit with you for a while." She worked through the afternoon and deep into the evening. No willow bark in the medicine box, but there was dried chamomile, a piece of dried ginger root gone slightly soft with age but still fragrant, and a jar of honey in the back of the pantry that was nearly empty but held enough. She made a tea and coaxed small spoonfuls of it into Della when the girl surfaced enough to swallow. She cooled compresses in the basin and laid them against Della's neck and the insides of her wrists, where the pulse beat closest to the surface and the cooling worked fastest. She talked softly and without stopping about small things. The sound the wind made against the window glass, the way the fire in the kitchen threw light into the hallway, a brown bird she had seen on the fence post when the wagon stopped. Not because the words mattered, but because the voice did. Because sick children needed to know that the dark around them held something other than silence. Garrett brought her things when she asked for them. A fresh cloth, more water, a spare candle when the first one burned low. He did not hover in the doorway, which she was grateful for. He did not disappear entirely either, which she also noted. Sometime after the dinner hour, which neither of them ate, she became aware that he was sitting outside the door. Not inside, never inside, but in the hallway, close enough to hear if something changed, far enough to leave her room to work. She could see the edge of his boot in the lamplight that fell through the crack of the door. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who was not asleep, but had given up on going anywhere. She did not say anything about it. She turned back to Della and kept working. The fever broke in the deep part of the night, in that long, cold hour before the dark begins to loosen its hold. Wren felt it happen beneath her palm, the shift in temperature, subtle at first, and then unmistakable. The girl's breathing changed from something labored and effortful to something looser, something that belonged to genuine sleep rather than the restless, exhausted state that accompanied high fever. Wren sat back in the chair she had pulled to the bedside and pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed out slowly and at length, the way she always did when the turning point arrived, and the outcome was no longer in question. She looked toward the door. The boot was gone. The hallway beyond was dark and quiet. She stayed until morning anyway. The light came through the east-facing window and turned the room the pale gold of early autumn, and Wren was still in the chair when Della opened her eyes. The girl lay quiet for a moment, taking stock, her gaze moving from the ceiling to the window to the woman sitting at her bedside, with the careful, measuring look of a child who had learned not to trust new things without first assessing them thoroughly. "You're not Mrs. Aldrich," she said. Her voice was rough from the coughing, but present, fully present, which was the best possible sign. "No," Wren agreed. "I'm not." "Who are you?" "My name is Wren. I came yesterday." Della considered this seriously, the way children considered things they intended to form real opinions about. Her color was better. The hectic flush had faded and left behind something closer to her natural tone, and her eyes, though tired, were clear. "Are you staying?" she asked. The question was simple and direct, and entirely without artifice, the way children's most important questions always were. Wren opened her mouth to answer, and heard a footstep in the hallway. Garrett filled the doorway. He had been there long enough to hear the question. She was certain of it. His face was still in the way it was always still, but something had changed in the set of his shoulders since the previous evening. Something had shifted in the hours he had spent sitting outside this door in the dark, listening to a woman he did not know work to save a child. He did not know how to save himself. He looked at Della first, then at Wren. She saw in his face the ghost of what he had prepared, the careful, considerate words of the letter he had written and carried and never sent. She saw him weigh those words against what was in front of him now. A child, awake and asking questions. A woman who had sat in a chair all night without being asked to. A morning that looked different than the morning he had expected to have. He put the letter down. Not literally. It was already ash in the fireplace, but she could see him do it, the way the decision moved through him and settled. "You can stay," he said, "as long as you need." It was not a welcome in the traditional sense. There was no warmth in it yet, no softness, but it was real, and it was freely given, and it was enough. Wren looked at Della. "Yes," she said, "I'm staying." Della received this with a small nod, the nod of a child who had learned to accept good news quietly and without display, in case making too much of it caused it to reconsider. She settled back against the pillow and pulled the quilt to her chin and closed her eyes, and within a few minutes her breathing had found the long, slow rhythm of real rest. The rest that came after danger had passed, and the body finally believed it. Garrett stepped back from the doorway. Wren rose from the chair, her back aching in the way that came from a night spent in furniture not designed for sleeping, and moved into the hallway. She pulled the door mostly closed behind her. They stood in the narrow passage with the smell of wood smoke coming from the kitchen and the morning light beginning to reach the end of the hall. "I'll need to understand the household," she said, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb Della. "Where things are, what's expected of me, and what isn't." He nodded once. "And I'll need to sleep at some point." Something crossed his face that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a different expression. "There's a room off the back of the house," he said. "It has a lock." She looked at him. He met her eyes without evasion. "All right," she said. He turned toward the kitchen. She followed him into the morning light, into the smell of coffee he had put on at some point in the early hours, into the plain and practical space of a man's life that had not yet learned to make room for anyone else. She did not see what he did next. She did not see him reach into his coat pocket and take out the envelope. The letter that explained everything, that laid out clearly and fairly all the reasons the arrangement no longer suited him. She did not see him hold it for a moment over the open door of the firebox, the sealed paper going warm in his hand. She did not see him let it go. The paper caught in an instant and was gone in seconds, and the small flame it made was no different from any other, and the smoke rose up the chimney and dispersed into the autumn air until there was nothing left of it at all. Not the words, not the decision, not the 3 weeks of careful reconsidering that had produced them. Outside, the morning was cold and clear and very wide. The hills held their color against a sky that had not yet fully decided what kind of day it intended to be. A small brown bird sat on the fence post near the gate, going about the ordinary business of being alive. Wren sat down across from Garrett at the kitchen table. He was holding a coffee cup in both hands, the way people held things they were not ready to put down. He did not look up immediately, and she did not require him to. She looked out the window at the land beyond the fence. Pale and dry and enormous, it asked nothing of her yet. Only presence. Only the willingness to remain when remaining was difficult. That she had always been able to manage. The coffee was dark and strong, and she wrapped her hands around the cup he had set in front of her without her asking, and felt the warmth of it move through her palms and up into her arms. And for the first time in a very long time, she sat with another person in morning quiet and felt the silence between them as something that might, eventually, become comfortable. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them left. And somewhere in the back room, Della slept on, breathing easy, turning slowly toward morning like a small thing finding its way back to the light. The first week passed the way first weeks in unfamiliar places always passed, in the accumulation of small details that would later seem obvious but in the moment required learning. Which floorboard near the kitchen door creaked if stepped on at the wrong angle? Which window latch needed lifting before it would turn? How the well rope ran a little short on the left side and had to be fed carefully or it would catch. How Garrett took his coffee. Black, no sugar, poured when it was still too hot for most people to drink, which suggested either that he had burned away the relevant nerves long ago, or that he simply did not notice discomfort the way other people did. Wren noticed everything. She had always been a noticer. It had served her well in useful ways and painful ones, and she had long since stopped trying to do it less. Della recovered quickly, the way children recovered from fevers when the fever was caught in time, not gradually, the way adults recovered, but in a sudden, decisive return to herself, as though her body had simply agreed one morning to be well again, and then committed to it fully. By the 3rd day, she was sitting up demanding food. By the 5th, she was following Wren through the house with the focused, silent attention of a child conducting a private investigation. By the end of the week, she was outdoors again, trailing after the barn cats with a length of string and a patience that Wren recognized as the particular patience of someone who had learned to entertain herself. Garrett watched all of this from varying distances. He was in the barn by the time Wren rose each morning and did not come in from the fields until the light was going. He ate what she put in front of him without comment, which she took initially as indifference and revised over several evenings into something more like restraint. A man who had spent years eating whatever was available and had trained himself not to have opinions about it, and who was now confronted with food that warranted opinions and did not quite know what to do with the feeling. On the fifth evening, she made a proper supper, not the plain functional meals she had been producing while she found her footing, but a real one, the kind that required time and attention and the willingness to use the better part of what was in the pantry. Braised beef with onions and dried herbs, biscuits that came out of the oven the right color, preserved peaches from the back shelf of the pantry that she had found behind a box of nails, as though someone had put them there intending to forget them. Garrett sat down across from Della and looked at the table, and then he looked at Wren with an expression she could not entirely parse. It was not surprise exactly, and it was not gratitude exactly. It was something older than either of those things. Something that had been put away a long time ago and was now being taken out and held carefully, the way people held objects they were not sure they still had the right to want. "This is," he started and then stopped. "It's supper," Wren said, and sat down and passed the biscuits to Della. He did not say anything else, but he ate with the attention of a man tasting something he had forgotten existed, and when he finished, he sat for a moment longer than usual before pushing back his chair, and Wren filed that away with everything else she was filing. It was on the sixth night that she found the ledger. She had not been looking for it specifically. She had been looking for the household accounts in the general sense, the record of what the ranch spent and earned and owed, the kind of document that told a more honest story about a place than anything the people in it were likely to say directly. She had asked Garrett where he kept the accounts on the second day, and he had opened a drawer in the desk in the front room and gestured at it and left her to it. The ledger was a large flat book, dark green, its spine cracked from use. She had assumed it was current and had set it aside to look at when she had a moment. The moment came on the sixth night, after Della was asleep and Garrett had gone out to do the last check of the animals. Wren sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a candle close and went through it the way she went through all accounts, methodically, from the beginning, column by column. She was 20 minutes in when she stopped. She went back 3 pages and looked again. Then she found a scrap of paper in the desk drawer and began writing figures, checking them against each other, following the pattern she thought she had seen to confirm it was a pattern and not coincidence. It was not coincidence. The discrepancy was not large in any single entry. That was the first thing she noticed, and the most telling. Whoever had created it understood that large discrepancies were found, and small ones were missed. A few dollars here, a different figure there, a payment recorded twice under different headings, a withdrawal that appeared in one column and not in the balancing column where it should have been reflected. Individually, each error looked like carelessness. Together, over the span of many months, they told a different story. Money was leaving the ranch through a gap that had been deliberately made to look like wear in the seam rather than a cut. Wren sat with her scrap of paper and looked at the numbers she had written and felt something she recognized from the last time she had sat with someone else's accounts and seen something she was not meant to see. A cold, clear, focused attention. The feeling of a pattern becoming visible. The knowledge that she now knew something that could not be unknown, and that the question of what to do with it was entirely separate from the question of what it meant. She closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer and went to bed. She lay in the dark of the small back room, which did have a lock, as Garrett had promised, a good solid one, and thought about what she had found, and thought about what it meant to have found it, and thought about the question she had not yet answered, which was why she was here in the first place, and what she was prepared to do about any of it. She did not tell him the next morning. She watched him instead, the way he moved through the ranch, the efficiency of it, the quiet authority of a man who understood every inch of his own land. The way he spoke to the horses with a different voice than he used for anything else, lower and more patient, as though they were worth explaining things to. The way he handed Della a biscuit at breakfast without looking at her and without saying anything, a gesture so habitual it was clearly not performed for anyone's benefit. She thought, "This is a man who does not know what is being done to him." She thought, "And that is not the same as a man who deserves it." She held on to the information and kept watching. Clem Rourke arrived on the 8th day. Wren was at the water pump when the horse came through the gate, and she straightened and turned and assessed him in the few seconds before he saw her doing it. He was a well-made man, somewhere past 50, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something more calculated. A face that had learned how to present itself. His clothes were better than working clothes, but worn with the ease of someone accustomed to money rather than the self-consciousness of someone newly arrived at it. He sat his horse with a comfort that spoke of long habit. He saw her, and his expression did not change, which was more interesting than if it had. "I don't believe we've met," he said, swinging down from the saddle with an ease that belied his age. Clem Rourke. He said his own name the way people said the names of places everyone already knew, as information rather than introduction. "Wren Holt," she said. He smiled. It was a good smile, technically, the right amount of warmth, the right amount of ease. It did not reach far enough. "You must be the new..." He paused in a way that was not quite a pause, that carried its weight in the half-second of assessment before he finished. "Help." "I came on a contract," she said. Her voice was pleasant, and her face was pleasant, and she offered him nothing beyond the words themselves. "Of course." He looked past her toward the barn. "Is Garrett about?" "He's in the south field. I can let him know you are here." "No need." He was already moving toward the barn with the familiarity of a man who considered himself exempt from ordinary social navigation. "I'll find him." Wren watched him go. She noted the way he had looked at the house before he looked at the barn. She noted the particular quality of his smile. The smile of a man who had just found something he had been looking for, and was being careful not to look too pleased about it. She went back to the pump and finished what she had been doing, and she thought about what she had seen in the ledger, and she thought about the way Clem Rourke had paused before calling her the help. That evening, after supper, while Della was occupied with the cats on the back porch, Wren sat across from Garrett at the kitchen table and set the scrap of paper in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "I went through the accounts," she said. "I should have told you I was going to, and I apologize for that. But I wanted to understand the ledger before I said anything about it." She kept her voice even and her hands still on the table. "There's a pattern in the figures that I don't think is accidental. Money leaving through entries that don't balance when you look at them together. I've written down what I found." He picked up the scrap of paper. She watched his face while he read it, watched the careful blankness he maintained and the thing that moved beneath it. He read through the figures twice. Then he set the paper down and was quiet for a long time. "These entries," he said finally, Most of them are from the past year and a half. Yes. He was silent again. His hands were flat on the table. Outside, Della could be heard murmuring something to one of the cats in the sing-song tone children used when they did not need a response. Someone signed off on these, he said. Not a question. The statement of a man beginning to understand the shape of something he had not seen clearly before. Yes, Wren said, but not in every case the same hand. He looked up at her sharply. The handwriting changes in some entries, she said. Not all of them. Most of them look like your signature or close enough to pass. But in several of the earlier ones, the ones from further back, the pen pressure is different. The lettering is the same, but the weight behind it isn't. She paused. I have some experience reading accounts that have been altered. I know what deliberate looks like. Garrett sat with that for a moment. The fire in the kitchen stove ticked and settled. Clem Rourke came today, he said. I know. I spoke with him at the pump. Something shifted in his expression. What did you make of him? Wren looked at the table, then at Garrett. I think he was looking for something when he wrote in, and I think he found something he wasn't expecting when he found me instead. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then, don't mention this to anyone. What you found in the ledger. I won't, she said. I made a copy of the relevant entries. It's in my room. He looked at her. The look held something she had not seen from him before. Not gratitude, not surprise, but something more particular than either. The look of a man who has been accustomed to being alone with his problems and has found, unexpectedly, that he is not alone with this one. You did that before you told me, he said. Yes? Why? She met his eyes. Because the information is safer in two places than one. He held her gaze for several seconds, and then he nodded once, and the conversation was over. He pushed back his chair and went to check the animals, and Wren collected the supper dishes and heated water in the basin. And through the back window she could see Della on the porch steps in the last of the daylight. The tabby cat settled in her lap with the authority of a creature that had claimed something and intended to keep it. The competence display, when it came, was not something Wren planned. It was 2 days after the conversation about the ledger, a Thursday morning, when she heard the commotion from the near pasture. She was in the kitchen garden, doing what could be done with it this late in the season, when the sounds reached her. Not shouting exactly, but the particular urgent noise of men and animals in a situation that was going wrong faster than it was being managed. She put down the trowel and went around the side of the house to see what was happening. The bull had come through the fence at the northeast corner of the near pasture. It was a large animal, dark-coated and currently enraged by something. Its own escape, probably. The way animals were sometimes enraged by the very freedom they had sought. And it was moving with the lurching, dangerous energy of a creature that had no plan but a great deal of momentum. Garrett was on foot at the pasture gate, which was the wrong position. 2 of the ranch's working hands were on the far side, which was further wrong. The bull was between them and moving toward the unfenced ground at the property's edge, which bordered the neighboring land, and if it crossed that boundary, the situation would become considerably more complicated. Wren looked at the scene for approximately 3 seconds. Then she went to the fence, climbed the lower rail, and sat on the top one. She had grown up watching her father work cattle on difficult days. She had learned, without being formally taught, that cattle responded to stillness, and to the particular quality of attention that was neither threatening nor retreating. The attention of something that simply was and intended to remain, and had no strong feelings about what the animal did next. It was the attention of a fence post, the attention of part of the landscape. She sat on the rail and was still. The bull moved in her direction. She did not move. It slowed. She remained. It stopped and regarded her with the suspicious, calculating expression of an animal that had expected a reaction and had not received one, and was now uncertain about the nature of the threat. She waited. It huffed. It turned its head. It took a step toward the open ground at the property edge, and she shifted her weight and made a sound, not loud, not sharp, just present, just a low-carrying note that said, "Here, this direction. Nothing to be concerned about, but this direction." And the bull's attention came back to her. She kept it there for 4 minutes, long enough for Garrett to circle wide and come around on the other side, long enough for the animal's agitation to begin losing its energy, long enough for the situation to stop being an emergency and become merely a problem, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more manageable. When it was done, the bull back in the pasture, the fence gap temporarily stopped. Garrett walked toward her. She was climbing down from the rail, brushing fence dust off her skirt. She did not look up immediately. When she did, he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before. She had seen his neutral face, and his careful face, and his face when he was with Della, which was the most unguarded of the three. This was something else. The face of a man who has revised an assumption and is honest enough with himself to know that he has done it. He did not say anything about what she had just done. He said, "The fence needs a proper repair. I'll get to it this afternoon." "I can help," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. That was all. But the quality of the silence between them on the walk back to the house was different from the silence that had been there before, and they both knew it, and neither of them remarked upon it, which was perhaps the most honest thing that had passed between them yet. Della, who had watched the whole thing from the back porch with her arms folded on the railing and her chin resting on her arms, said to Wren when she came through the gate, "How did you know that would work?" "My father showed me," Wren said. Della considered this. Was he a cowboy? He worked cattle. I'm not sure he would have called himself that. What would he have called himself? Wren thought about it. "Tired, mostly," she said, and Della laughed. A sudden, surprised laugh. The kind that came out before a person decided whether they were going to laugh. And Wren felt something ease in her chest at the sound of it. That night, she was in the small back room, reviewing her copy of the ledger entries by candlelight, when she heard hoofbeats approaching the house, late for a visitor. She listened. The horse stopped at the gate. A knock at the front door. Not the hesitant knock of someone uncertain of their welcome, but the particular knock of someone who had decided in advance that they had a right to knock. She heard Garrett's steps in the hallway, heard the door open, heard Clem Rourke's voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "Evening, Garrett. Sorry for the hour. Mind if I come in for a few minutes? I have something I'd like to discuss with you, and with with Miss Holt, if she's available." A pause. Then Garrett's voice, flat and without welcome. "She's not." Another pause. "Another time, then," Clem said, and his voice had the quality of a man accepting a delay he had anticipated. "I'll be in touch." The door closed. Wren sat in the dark of her room with the ledger entries in her hand, and thought about what Clem Rourke wanted with her specifically, and why he had come at this hour, and what it meant that he had asked for her by name. She did not sleep easily, but she noted, as she lay in the dark, that the sound of Garrett's steps retreating down the hallway had been slower than usual, as though he had stood at the closed door for a moment before moving away from it, making sure whatever was on the other side had fully gone. She thought about that for a long time. And then, 3 days later, Clem Rourke found her alone. Garrett had ridden out to the far pasture to assess the fall grass, a trip that would take most of the morning. Della was at the neighbor woman's house 2 miles east, where she spent Thursday mornings learning her letters. Wren was in the kitchen, working through a pile of mending that had been accumulating in the basket by the door, when she heard a horse at the gate and looked up to see Clem Rourke dismounting in the yard. She put the mending down and went to the door. He was pleasant and unhurried and entirely at ease, which was more alarming than if he had been neither. He did not ask to come in. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and smiled in the way that had not reached far enough the first time, and did not reach far enough now. "I wanted to speak with you," he said. "Privately, if you don't mind." "About what, Mr. Rourke?" "About the ranch." He looked out at the land beyond the fence with the expression of a man surveying something he already considers his. "And about your position here, which I understand is somewhat undefined." Wren said nothing. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "A practical one. There are certain documents that belong to this ranch. Historical ones, related to the original land arrangement. A box, specifically. Wooden, about this size." He indicated with his hands. "Kept somewhere on the property. If you were to find it and bring it to me, I could ensure that you were taken care of when the time comes, when circumstances here change." He said it all very reasonably, very quietly, in the tone of a man describing a straightforward business arrangement between sensible people. The tone of someone accustomed to making offers in language smooth enough that the ugliness beneath it stayed hidden until later. Wren looked at him for a long moment. The morning air was cool and very still, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted its weight against its stall, and the sound carried clearly in the quiet. "Mr. Rourke," she said. Her voice was even and unhurried and gave nothing away. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" He smiled again, with the patience of a man who was used to waiting for people to arrive at the answer he had already decided on. "I'm asking you to be practical. That's all." "What you're asking me," she said carefully, "is to go through this house, through a man's private property, find something he doesn't know I'm looking for, and bring it to you, in exchange for a promise about circumstances that haven't happened yet." She paused. "From a man I met once at a water pump." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something colder than anger. Assessment. "I would encourage you to think about your position here," he said, "which is, as I said, undefined." "Thank you," said Wren. "I'll think about it." He put his hat back on and went to his horse and rode out through the gate, and she stood on the porch and watched him go. The dust his horse raised settled slowly back onto the road, and then the road was empty and still and looked exactly as it had looked before he arrived. Wren went back inside. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed steadily for a moment, because she was not going to give herself the indulgence of shaking when there was no one there to make shaking useful. She thought about what he had asked her. She thought about the box he had described, wooden, a certain size, and whether such a thing was somewhere in this house, and what it might contain that was worth what he had implied it was worth. She thought about Garrett, somewhere in the far pasture, moving through his land with no idea what had just happened in his own kitchen yard. She got up and went to her room and took out the copy of the ledger entries from beneath the mattress where she kept it. She sat on the edge of the bed and read through it again, and this time she read it with the knowledge of what Clem Rourke had just asked her, and the pattern was clearer now than it had been the first time she saw it, the way patterns always became clearer when you understood what they were in service of. She put the papers back. She smoothed the mattress over them. She went to the window and looked out at the land, at the pale grass and the weathered fences and the hills beyond, holding their color against the autumn sky. She thought, he has been doing this for a long time. She thought, and Garrett does not know. And then she thought the thing she had been avoiding thinking, the thing that required her to be honest with herself about why she was still here and what she was prepared to do about it. She thought, I know, and that means I have to decide what to do with knowing. Outside, the morning continued as mornings did, indifferent to decisions, patient with the time it took to make them. A crow landed on the fence post at the far edge of the yard and regarded the world with the ancient, unsentimental attention of its kind. From somewhere far off, too far to see, came the faint sound of a horse moving at a steady pace across open ground. Garrett, coming back. Wren put on her coat and went out to meet him. She told him everything, not immediately. She waited until supper was done, and Della was in bed and the kitchen had settled into its evening quiet, the stove ticking as it cooled, and the lamplight steadying against the dark outside the windows. She waited because some information needed to be delivered in the right conditions, not hurriedly, not defensively, but with enough space around it that the person receiving it could sit with it properly rather than react to it. She set her coffee cup down and told him about Clem Rourke's visit, all of it, in the order it had happened, without editorializing. What he had asked for, the size and description of the box, the offer he had made, the way he had waited until the yard was empty before riding in. Garrett listened without interrupting. He sat with his forearms on the table and his hands loosely together and his eyes on her face. And he did not move while she spoke except to breathe. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to have a shape. He came while I was in the far field, he said finally. Yes. He knew I was gone. He came from the eastern road. He would have seen you ride out. Garrett looked at the table. His jaw worked once, the way it did when he was holding something in that wanted out. Then he was still again. The box he described, Wren said carefully. Do you know what he means? Something changed in his face, a recognition that he tried to keep from showing and did not entirely succeed at. He pushed back from the table and moved to the far end of the kitchen, turning his back for a moment, looking out at the dark yard where nothing was moving. May kept a box, he said. His voice had changed, not softer exactly, but less defended. The voice he used when he was being precise about something that cost him something to be precise about. A wooden one. She used it for documents she considered important. I haven't looked at it since she died. Wren waited. I don't know where it is now. He turned from the far end of the kitchen. I assumed it was in the house somewhere. I didn't look for it because I didn't. He stopped, started again. I wasn't ready to go through her things. I kept meaning to. I kept putting it off. Clem Rourke knows it exists, Wren said, and he believes it contains something he needs, which means he's known about it for longer than now. Garrett's voice had gone quiet in the way that was different from his ordinary quiet. This was the quiet of a man arriving at an understanding he did not like. He's been waiting, letting time pass, letting me... He did not finish the sentence. Letting the ledger accumulate, Wren said. He looked at her steadily. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. We should find it before he does, Wren said. They searched the house the following morning while Della was outdoors with the cats, methodically and without discussion, each taking a different room. It was Della who found it. She came in through the kitchen door at mid-morning with dirt on her knees and a wooden box held in both hands, carrying it with the careful seriousness of someone transporting something understood to be important without knowing precisely why. It was the size of a small document case, dark with age and handling, its hinges gone green at the edges. A simple latch on the front, no lock. I found it under the floor in the old storeroom, Della said. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it and then at Wren. There's a loose board in the back corner. I found it because one of the cats went under there. She said it with the matter-of-fact practicality of a child reporting a discovery. And then she looked at the box again and said, more quietly, "It smells like her. Like beeswax and dried lavender. That's what May always smelled like." The kitchen went very still. Garrett stood in the doorway. He was looking at the box with the expression of a man who had just been handed something he had been both searching for and dreading. Something he needed and was not sure he was ready for. His hands were at his sides. He did not move toward the table. Wren looked at him. He looked at the box. Della looked at both of them with the quiet, watchful attention of a child who understood that something important was happening and that her role in it was to be still. "I'll take Della out to the garden," Wren said. "Give you some time." "No." His voice was low but decided. "Stay." She stayed. He came to the table and sat down and put his hands on either side of the box without opening it. Della came and stood beside him, and after a moment he put his arm around her shoulders, briefly, and she leaned into him for exactly as long as the moment lasted, and then straightened again. It was the most natural thing Wren had seen pass between them, and it happened the way natural things happened, without anyone deciding to do it. He opened the box. Inside, organized in the careful way of a person who kept documents as though they might one day be needed in a hurry, were several folded papers, a small leather-bound notebook, and on top of everything else, an envelope, not sealed, addressed in a hand Wren did not know. A woman's hand, she thought, from the particular quality of the letter forms. The way certain letters leaned into each other as though for company. The envelope was addressed to Garrett. He picked it up and looked at his own name, written in his dead wife's handwriting, and whatever was in his face in that moment was not for anyone else. Wren looked at the table. Della looked at the window. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside, a horse moved in its stall. He unfolded the letter and read it. Wren did not watch him read. She kept her eyes on the table and listened to the silence and let it be what it needed to be. She heard the sound of the paper. She heard him breathe. She heard him stop breathing for a moment and then resume. When he looked up, his eyes were red at the edges, not wet. He was not a man who wept easily, or apparently at all, but the redness of someone who was holding something very tightly inside in order not to. "She knew," he said. His voice was rough and even at the same time, the voice of control that was costing something. She knew what Clem was doing. She wrote it down. He set the letter on the table. She tried to tell me. She brought it up. The accounts, some irregularity she had noticed. And I told her she was worrying about nothing. That Clem was family, and she should let it go. He stopped. She let it go. But she wrote it all down, and she put it in this box. And she left it where she thought I would find it when I was ready. The kitchen was very quiet. She wasn't angry, he said, and this seemed to be the thing that was hardest to hold. In the letter, she wasn't. She understood that I hadn't listened, and she wasn't angry about it. She just wanted to make sure the information existed somewhere, in case it was needed later. Wren looked at the letter on the table. She could see the first lines from where she sat, not reading, just seeing. And then her eyes caught the last lines, which were written in a slightly different hand than the rest, as though added at a different time. The ink, a slightly different shade. She did not read it. It was not hers to read. But Garrett, following her gaze, looked down at the letter, and then he picked it up and held it out to her. "The last part," he said. "You should see it." She took it. She read the last lines. "If there is a woman who reads this, whoever you are, however you came to be here, please stay beside him, not because he will ask you to. He will not ask. But because he is worth the staying, even when he makes it difficult, and he will make it difficult, because he does not know yet that he is allowed to want things again. Help him remember that he is." Wren read it twice. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back on the table, and she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and the kitchen around her, and the weight of a dead woman's words settling into the room like something that had always belonged there and had only now arrived. She did not look at Garrett. She looked at the other papers in the box, which were what needed to be looked at now. "May I?" she asked. He nodded. She took the documents out carefully and laid them on the table in order. The land contract, original, signed, with a series of witness marks along the margin that indicated it had been executed with considerable formality. The small notebook, which turned out to be May's own accounting record, kept in parallel to the household ledger, tracking the same figures with her own notations in the margins. And at the bottom of the box, a single sheet of paper on which May had written, in a clear, deliberate hand, a list of dates and amounts, and a name. Clem Rourke. The amounts corresponded, when Wren checked them against her own copy of the ledger entries, to the exact discrepancies she had found. Not approximately, exactly. May had found the same pattern Wren had found, had tracked it to its source, and had written the source down. Wren sat back. "She did your work for you," she said. "Both of our work. Years ago." Garrett looked at his wife's notebook, at the small, precise handwriting that had survived her by 4 years, that had been waiting under a loose floorboard in a cold storeroom for someone to come along and need it. His face held something that Wren could not name and did not try to, because it belonged entirely to him and to the woman whose handwriting was on the page. "She was smarter than me," he said, "about most things." "Tell me about her," Wren said. She said it quietly, without thinking about whether it was the right thing to say. It came out because it was true. She wanted to know, and the wanting was simple and honest and had no motive beyond itself. Garrett looked at her. He seemed to weigh the question, not its appropriateness, but its size, checking whether he could answer it without losing something he was not yet ready to lose. She argued with everything, he said at last. Every opinion I had. Not to be contrary. She thought differently than I did, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. A pause. She was right more often than I was. About people, especially. She could read a room in 30 seconds and tell you exactly what everyone in it actually wanted, as opposed to what they were saying they wanted. She would have seen through Clem immediately. She did see through him, from the first visit. He looked at the notebook. I told her she was being uncharitable. Wren said nothing. She also... He stopped. Something moved across his face. She didn't sleep well. She'd be up at strange hours, moving around the house. I used to find her at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. with coffee gone cold beside her, reading something, or just sitting. She said the house was different at night. Quieter in a useful way. He paused. I never understood that. I slept fine. Some people think better when the world has stopped making noise, Wren said. He looked at her. Do you? She considered it. Yes, she said. I do. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she would have liked you, I think. She had a high tolerance for people who worked without needing to explain themselves. It was not a declaration. It was not even quite a compliment. It was simply an observation, offered plainly, in the tone of a man who had decided to say a true thing, and then said it. Wren felt it land somewhere in her chest and stayed still while it did. Over the days that followed, the space between them changed in the way that spaces changed between people who had been through something together and had not discussed it directly, but both knew it had happened. It was not warmth, exactly. Not yet. It was something more structural than warmth. A different arrangement of the existing distance. The way furniture rearranged in a room did not make the room larger, but made it easier to move through. Della noticed, as Della noticed most things. She had the gift of the observant child, the ability to register change without yet having the language to name it, and the wisdom, when she had it, to leave the thing she had noticed alone. She did ask Wren one evening, while they were shelling dried beans at the kitchen table, whether Wren was going to stay for winter. I don't know yet, Wren said. Why? Because last winter was cold, Della said, with the simplicity of a child stating a fact that was also an argument. And it's better when there are more people. Wren shelled beans for a moment. Yes, she said finally. It usually is. The fence that had been temporarily repaired after the bull incident needed proper work, and Garrett had been waiting for a dry stretch of days. When it came, Wren came with him as she had offered, and they worked through the morning on opposite sides of the same stretch of fence, replacing the damaged rails, setting the loose post in new concrete, working in the companionable rhythm that developed between people who understood the same kind of labor. It was late morning when his hand closed over hers on the handle of the post driver. Not to take it. She had been managing it without difficulty. But because she had shifted her grip at the same moment he reached to adjust the post, and their hands landed in the same place at the same time, and neither of them moved immediately. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to be something, short enough to remain unaddressed. Garrett withdrew his hand and straightened the post, and they went back to work, and neither of them spoke about it. And the silence afterward was different from the silence before. Slightly warmer, slightly more careful, the way silences became when they were covering something both people had noticed, and neither was quite ready to name. That evening, after Della was asleep, Wren told him what she had worked out about the timeline. Clem's pattern in the accounts went back further than she had initially seen, further even than May's records documented. The groundwork had been laid quietly, gradually, over years. A record here adjusted, a document there mishandled. Small things that individually meant nothing and together built a case that Garrett had been mismanaging his own land. The kind of case that, presented to the right authority at the right moment, could strip a man of what he had built. "He's not in a hurry," she said. "He never has been. He's been building this the way you'd build a fence, one post at a time, taking care that each one is solid before moving to the next." Garrett was quiet for a long time. "He was at May's funeral," he said. "He stood beside me. I thought he was grieving." "He may have been," Wren said. "People can grieve and scheme at the same time. It doesn't take much room in a person, apparently, if they've had enough practice." Garrett looked at her. "You've known people like that." It was not a question, and she did not answer it as one. "The man who ran the household where I worked before my marriage. He had a talent for appearing to care about what he was destroying." She kept her voice even. "I know what it looks like from the inside of it." "Your husband," Garrett said carefully, not asking, leaving the door open. "My husband was not a bad man," she said. "He was a weak one, which in some ways is harder to be angry at. He let his mother make decisions for both of us. And when he died, the decisions she had made became the walls of a very small room." She paused. "I was in that room for 2 years before I understood that the door had been there the whole time." Garrett was looking at the table. "What opened it?" "Running out of reasons to stay closed," she said. "And an advertisement in a paper that a woman at the boarding house left behind when she checked out." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular roughness of a man saying something he had thought about but not planned to say, "I wrote that advertisement 3 times before I sent it. Threw the first 2 away. The third one I sent before I could think about it too much." "Why did you send it at all if you changed your mind?" He looked at the dark beyond the kitchen window. "Because being alone it was fine. I was managing, but Della kept getting sick, and I didn't know what to do when she was sick, and there was no one to ask. And one evening, I sat at this table, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought that I was tired of there being no one to ask." Wren looked at him. His profile in the lamplight was the profile of a man who had admitted something and was waiting to see what happened now that it was out in the air. "And then you changed your mind," she said. "And then I thought about what it would mean. Someone in the house, another person's—" He paused, searching for the word. "Another person's weight, in a space that had arranged itself around one person's weight. I thought it would be too much." "Is it?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. It was the most direct look he had given her since the morning she arrived, and it held something she recognized, not as something she had seen in him before, but as something she knew from her own experience. The look of a person assessing whether a true answer was safe to give. "No," he said. "It isn't." The word sat between them without elaboration. He did not add to it. She did not ask him to. They sat for a moment longer in the kitchen, the lamp burning low between them, and then Wren stood and said goodnight and went to her room. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and thought about the look on his face and about May's handwriting and about the wooden box on the kitchen shelf where they had put it, and about what it meant to be in a place long enough to begin to understand the weight of it. Outside, somewhere on the eastern road, a horse moved in the dark. She heard it clearly in the silence and noted it, and noted that it stopped, and after a long moment moved on again. It was probably nothing. She filed it alongside everything else she had been filing and let herself settle. She thought about Della asking whether she would stay for winter. She thought about the fence work that still needed doing on the north pasture. She thought about a loose floorboard in a cold storeroom, and a box that had waited 4 years for the right person to need what was inside it. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, she slept in the particular way she had not slept since before her marriage, without listening for the sound of something going wrong, without waiting for the other thing to happen. Just sleep, even and unguarded, in a room with a lock she had not used in 2 weeks. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a writer Wren did not recognize. A young man who handed the folded document to Garrett at the gate without meeting his eyes and left before anyone could ask him questions. Garrett read it standing in the yard, and Wren watched from the porch and knew from the way he stood that it was not good news. Not from the expression on his face, which she could not see from that distance, but from the stillness of him. The particular stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. The stillness of a man absorbing a blow rather than simply existing in the world. He came inside and set the document on the kitchen table. It was a formal notice of dispute issued through the Regional Land Authority, claiming that certain transactions on record indicated Garrett Voss had entered into agreements regarding the eastern parcels of his property. Agreements that, if verified, would transfer effective control of those parcels and the water access that ran through them to a third party pending full review. During the review period, which could extend through the end of the season and beyond, the ranch was restricted from executing any new financial transactions, selling livestock, or borrowing against the property. Wren read it twice. Then she sat down. The eastern parcels were not the largest portion of the ranch, but they held the creek that fed the water troughs across all the grazing land. Without that water access, the cattle could not graze the western fields through winter. Without the western fields, the herd would need to be moved to contracted grazing land elsewhere, which cost money the ranch did not have, because it could not sell cattle, because it could not execute financial transactions, because of the notice that was sitting on the kitchen table. It was elegant in the way that traps were elegant, constructed with enough moving parts that by the time the person inside it understood the mechanism had already closed. "He's been waiting for something," Garrett said. He set the document down and did not move for a moment, just stood at the table with his hands flat against the wood, the way a man stood when the ground had shifted and he was checking whether it would hold. Then he pulled out a chair and sat heavily and looked at the notice the way people looked at things they had been half expecting and still were not prepared for. "The end of the season," Wren said, "when the cattle need water most and the ground is too hard to dig new sources and there's no time left in the year to fight it through proper channels before the cold comes." "Yes. And the financial restriction means you can't hire legal help." "Not easily." She looked at the notice, at the signatures at the bottom and the seal, and the careful formal language that had been used to make something fundamentally dishonest look like the ordinary operation of legitimate process. She had seen this before, not in land disputes, but in the way that institutions could be used as instruments when the right people had the right access to them. And she felt the cold, clear recognition of it settle into her chest. Clem has someone on the authority board, she said. He has his brother-in-law on the authority board, Garrett said. Has for 3 years. I knew it, and I thought it didn't matter because I wasn't doing anything that would bring me before the board. He paused. I was wrong about that. Wren thought about the man she had spoken with at the gate 2 days ago, a rancher from the neighboring property who had stopped to discuss a shared fence line. He had been pleasant and unhurried and had mentioned, in the way that people mentioned things they believed were general knowledge, that 2 of Clem Rourke's hired men had been seen on the eastern road several mornings running early before the working day began. She had noted it and not yet mentioned it to Garrett because she had not known what it meant. She told him now. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, he was checking the parcels, making sure of the water access before he filed the notice, making sure of what he was getting. Before you knew there was anything to defend. Yes. Della was at the neighbor woman's house for the day. The kitchen was very quiet. The notice lay on the table between them, and neither of them looked at it directly, the way people did not look directly at things that were difficult to look at while they were still thinking about what to do. Wren stood up and went to her room, and came back with the copy of the ledger entries and May's notebook. She put them beside the notice on the table. We have the pattern of the accounts, she said. We have May's records. We have the original land contract from the box. She looked at him. If we can get these in front of someone who has authority over the board, someone outside Clem's reach, we have the evidence that the transactions were falsified. The nearest authority above the board is a 2-day ride, Garrett said. Then we prepare the documents and make the ride. He looked at her steadily. The restriction is already in place. The cattle need water now, not after a 2-day ride, and however long the review takes. If we leave to fight it through proper channels, we come back to a herd that's been without water access for a week or more. The silence that followed was the silence of 2 people confronting the reality that every available path had a cost attached to it that could not be reduced, only chosen. Who could watch the herd? Wren asked. The neighbor, Alderman. He offered last spring, you said. He's got his own animals to manage. Would he do it if you asked him directly? Not as a favor, but as a business arrangement. Promise him first use of the south grazing land in spring in exchange. Garrett looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular quality of attention a person gave when someone else said a thing they needed to hear, said by someone other than themselves. Maybe, he said. Then we ask him. Wren pulled the documents together and began organizing them with the methodical care she used for all things that needed to be in order to be useful. But first I need to go through everything again. All of it. The ledger, May's notebook, the land contract. I need to build the argument from the beginning so that whoever looks at it can follow it without us there to explain. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, Wren, she looked up. This isn't your fight, he said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things, as a statement of fact that he was presenting for her consideration, rather than a judgment he had already made. You came here on a contract. The contract doesn't include this. If you want to step back from it, if you want to take Della and go to the neighbor's house and let me manage this, I won't think less of you for it." She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the documents and the lamp and the 2 coffee cups that had gone cold while they were talking. She thought about May's letter. She thought about Della asking whether she was staying for winter. "You said I could stay as long as I needed," she said. "I did. I need to stay through this." She looked back at the documents. "Stop trying to make it easy for me to leave. It isn't helping." Another silence, and then, very quietly, a sound she had not heard from him before. A short exhale that was not quite a laugh, but had something of laughter's quality in it. The sound of a man who had been braced for an argument and had not received one, and did not know quite what to do with the absence of it. "All right," he said. She worked through the night. Garrett slept. She made him, told him flatly that he needed to be functional in the morning to ride to Alderman's property before the day got away from them, and that she did not require supervision. He went with the compliance of a man who understood the logic, even if the position of being told what to do was not one he was entirely comfortable in. She worked at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up as high as it would go, laying out the documents in order, writing a clear account of the pattern in the accounts. When it had started, how it had progressed, what each entry corresponded to, and what the cumulative effect had been. She used May's notebook as a parallel record, showing where May's own findings matched hers. She documented the land contract, the original terms, the discrepancies between those terms, and what appeared in the authorities' notice. She worked carefully and without haste, because careful work done without haste was the kind that held up. At some point in the early hours, she heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to find Garrett in the doorway, dressed and clearly not having slept. "I thought you were sleeping," she said. "I tried." He came into the kitchen and looked at what she had laid out on the table, the pages organized, annotated in her precise hand, each piece of evidence connected to the next in a chain a person could follow without losing the thread. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. "Sit down," she said. "There's coffee." He sat. He poured coffee for both of them, and then he said the thing that had apparently kept him from sleeping. "You should leave," he said. "Not because I want you to. Because what I'm about to tell you is going to make this more complicated, and you deserve to know it before you go any further." Wren put her pen down and looked at him. "Clem knows who you are," Garrett said. "Not just that you're here. He knows where you came from and why you left and what your situation was before you answered the advertisement." He paused. "He told me 2 days ago. I didn't tell you because I was trying to figure out what to do with it. He has correspondence. I don't know how he got it. That describes your circumstances before you came here. The debt your husband left. The mother-in-law. The fact that you left without legal resolution of the estate." Wren was very still. "He intends to use it," Garrett said. "If you stand as a witness for me, he'll use your past to discredit you. He'll say you came here with an agenda, that you're a woman with legal troubles of your own who has attached herself to a man in a vulnerable position for financial protection. He'll make what you found in the ledger look like fabrication, and he has the kind of presence that makes people believe him." The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. "You've known this for 2 days," Wren said. "Yes. That's why you've been telling me to step back." "Yes." She looked at the table, at the document she had spent the night organizing, at the careful argument she had built from May's evidence and her own, constructed to be clear and followable and unimpeachable. She thought about what he had said. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over problems. From every angle, looking for the place where it was weakest, and the place where it was strongest, and the place where it could be addressed directly. My legal situation from before, she said. The estate. I haven't resolved it because I didn't have the means to fight it. And going back meant going back to a place where I had nothing, and where the people who had wronged me had the social standing to continue doing so. She paused. But I'm not actually a woman with legal troubles. I'm a woman who was wronged by people with more power than I had, which is not the same thing. And any honest examination of the facts would show that. Clem Rourke is not interested in honest examination, Garrett said. No, but whoever we present this to might be. She looked at him directly. Do you believe me? About the ledger, about what I found. Yes. Then that's what matters. She picked up the pen again. He can say what he wants about where I came from. The numbers don't change based on where I came from. The pattern doesn't change. May's handwriting doesn't change. She looked at the papers. Let him try to discredit the arithmetic. Garrett sat with that. The lamp burned between them, steady in the still air of the kitchen. You'd be giving up something, he said carefully. If you stand as a witness, if this goes to the authority, your situation becomes a matter of public record. Things you might have preferred to keep private. I know. Wren. He said her name the way he had begun saying it over the past weeks, not as a form of address, but as a kind of attention, the way people said the names of things they were looking at carefully because the things mattered. You came here with nothing. You've built something here. A position, he paused. A place. If this goes wrong, you lose all of it. The ranch, if Clem wins. Your reputation. If he uses what he has against you, you'd be back to $11 and a traveling bag. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen on the morning she arrived. The expression of a man confronting something he had not prepared for. But it was different now. There was no wariness in it. There was only honesty. The careful honesty of a man putting the full picture in front of a person and trusting them to look at it clearly. I know, she said again. Then why? She was quiet for a moment. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the true one rather than the easy one. Because Della asked me if I was staying, she said. And I didn't want to answer that question until I knew whether staying was something I was choosing or just something I was doing because I had nowhere else to go. She looked at him steadily. This is me choosing. Garrett sat very still across the table. Outside, the night was at its deepest, that long, cold hour before anything began to change. No wind, no sound from the animals. The darkness outside the window was complete and absolute and held no movement. Then he said, I don't know how this ends. Neither do I. I might lose the ranch. You might. And you might lose. I know what I might lose. She held his gaze. I'm still here. He looked at her for a long time. And then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not briefly this time, not accidentally, but deliberately, with the full intention of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. His hand was rough with calluses and warm against her cold fingers, and he did not say anything else, and she did not need him to. The morning came cold and clear. Garrett rode to Alderman's property at first light and came back by mid-morning with a handshake agreement. Alderman would manage the water access and the herd for as long as was needed, in exchange for first use of the south grazing land come spring. It was a fair arrangement, and Alderman, who had no love for Clem Rourke and a long memory, had agreed to it with a directness that suggested he had been waiting to be asked. Della came home from the neighbor woman's house at noon and walked into a kitchen that felt different from the kitchen she had left that morning, though she would not have been able to say precisely how. She looked at Wren, and she looked at Garrett, and she set her things down and said, with the matter-of-fact pragmatism that was entirely her own, "Is something happening?" "Yes," Wren said, "but we're handling it." Della appeared to assess the credibility of this statement, found it satisfactory, and asked what was for lunch. Wren told her, and the kitchen resumed its ordinary functions, and the documents on the table were moved to the shelf where they would wait until morning. That evening, Garrett came to find Wren in the yard, where she was watching the last of the light leave the hills. He stood beside her, without speaking for a moment, which was ordinary, and then he said something that was not. "Whatever happens with the authority," he said, "whatever happens with the ranch, you should know, the contract we came here on, the arrangement we agreed to." He paused. "I'm not holding you to it. Not to any version of it. When this is done, whatever it looks like when it's done, you choose what comes next. Freely." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to push you away," he said carefully. "I'm saying it because—" He stopped, started again with the particular effort of a man for whom direct speech about certain things was still a new and difficult country. "Because what you did last night, what you're doing, it shouldn't be done because you feel obligated. It should be done because you choose it. And I want you to know the difference is, it matters to me which one it is." Wren looked at him in the failing light, at the face she had been reading for weeks, that had gradually become legible to her in the way that landscapes became legible when you had spent enough time in them, not all at once, but feature by feature, until one day you looked up and found you knew where you were. "I know the difference," she said. "I told you. I'm choosing." He nodded. He looked at the hills. The last of the light was almost gone, leaving only a thin line of amber along the ridge where the sky and the land met. "Then we go in the morning," he said. "We go in the morning," she agreed. They stood for another moment in the cooling dark, and then they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the yard was empty and still, and the hills held their darkness without apology. And somewhere in the house, Della was singing something tuneless and satisfied to herself, the sound of it drifting through the thin walls and into the night air and dissolving upward into a sky full of cold, indifferent, beautiful stars. The ride took 2 days, as Garrett had said it would. They left before dawn on the first morning. Della settled at Alderman's property with a bag packed for several nights, and the tabby cat in a basket that she had insisted was necessary and that no one had found the energy to argue against. The road was cold, and the sky was the particular dark that preceded dawn. Not black anymore, but not yet anything else, the color of a held breath. Wren rode beside Garrett and did not speak much, and he did not speak much, and the silence between them was the silence of two people who had already said what needed saying and were now simply moving toward what came next. She carried the documents in a leather satchel against her side. She had checked them 3 times before leaving. The organized account of the ledger discrepancies, May's notebook, the original land contract, the sheet in May's hand with Clem Rourke's name and the corresponding figures. She had also written, on a clean piece of paper, a brief account of her own circumstances, where she had come from, what had happened with the estate, the facts of it laid out plainly without self-pity or defensiveness. Because Garrett had told her Clem intended to use her past, and she had decided that the most effective response to that was to present her past herself, in her own words, before anyone else had the chance to shape it. She had done this at the kitchen table the night before they left, after Della was asleep, writing by lamplight with Garrett sitting across from her reading through the organized documents one final time. He had not asked what she was writing. When she finished and set the pen down, he had looked up. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He had nodded, and they had gone to their separate rooms. And that had been enough. The authority building was in a settlement 2 days' ride northeast, larger than the town nearest the ranch, with the particular character of a place that had grown around function rather than choice. Practical buildings on a wide main road, a livery at one end, a series of offices in a long wooden structure near the center that housed the various administrative functions of the surrounding territory. They arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, dusty and stiff from the road. Garrett saw to the horses while Wren found the relevant office and determined that the board convened the following morning, that their matter had been calendared. Clem had ensured that much, confident apparently in the outcome, and that they would be heard. She sent word to Garrett at the livery. They took separate rooms at the only boarding house, ate a quiet supper, and said good night in the hallway with the particular formality of 2 people who were holding themselves together by the discipline of routine. Wren lay in the dark of the unfamiliar room and thought about nothing useful for a long time. And then she thought about May's letter. And then she slept. The board convened at 9 in the morning in a long room with windows along one side that let in pale autumn light. There were 5 members, 4 men and 1 woman. The woman seated at the far end with the composed attention of someone accustomed to being underestimated and long past finding it interesting. A clerk sat to one side with paper and ink. Clem Rourke was already present when Garrett and Wren entered, seated at one of the 2 tables arranged before the board, his expression the expression of a man entirely at ease with the proceedings. He looked at Wren when she walked in, and his ease shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something else. She had seen that shift before, on the faces of people who had arranged things carefully, and then found that the arrangement had a variable they had not accounted for. The shift of someone recalibrating. She sat beside Garrett and placed the satchel on the table and folded her hands over it and looked at the board. The proceedings began with Clem's presentation, delivered through a representative who had clearly done this before. A man with the smooth, unhurried cadence of someone practiced in making complicated things sound straightforward. The falsified transactions were presented as fact, the authority notice justified, the restriction on the ranch's operations framed as a reasonable protective measure pending investigation. It was well done. Wren watched the board members' faces while it was delivered and noted which ones were following closely, and which ones had already formed opinions, and which one, the woman at the far end, was writing something in the margin of her papers. When Clem's representative finished, the board chair looked at Garrett. "Your response, Mr. Voss." Garrett stood. He was not a man given to speeches, and he did not give one now. He said, plainly and without excess, The transactions in question are fraudulent. I did not authorize them, and I did not sign them. The evidence for that is in the documents my witness will present." He sat down. The board chair looked at Wren. She stood. She had thought, the night before, about how to begin. She had considered several approaches and discarded them and arrived, finally, at the same conclusion she always arrived at when she thought long enough about a problem, that the simplest path was usually the most direct one. She opened the satchel and began placing documents on the table in front of her, and she said, "My name is Wren Holt. I came to Voss Ranch 6 weeks ago on a contract. I am not a disinterested party. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because the opposing party intends to raise it, and I would prefer to raise it myself." She looked at the board. "I have a personal interest in the outcome of this proceeding. I also have evidence, and the two things are not the same thing, and I would ask this board to hold them separately while I present what I found." The woman at the end of the board looked up from her papers. Her eyes were sharp and direct, and entirely without the condescension that Wren had half expected. She gave a single small nod. Not agreement, just attention. And Wren continued. She walked through the ledger entries. She walked through May's parallel records, explaining who May was and how the notebook had been found and what it contained. She laid May's sheet, the one with Clem's name and the corresponding figures, beside her own analysis and showed how the numbers matched. She presented the original land contract and indicated the specific points at which the authority notice's claims contradicted its terms. And then she placed the last piece of paper on the table, her own account of her circumstances, written in her own hand the night before she left the ranch. She slid it toward the board. "The opposing party has correspondence regarding my background," she said. "I don't know how he obtained it, but I assume he intends to use it to suggest that my findings are motivated by self-interest, or that my character is such that my testimony cannot be trusted." She kept her voice even and her hands still. "I have written my own account of my circumstances, and I offer it to this board directly, so that you may read it in my words rather than his. Everything in it is true. None of it changes what is in the ledger." Clem's representative rose to object. The board chair held up a hand. The woman at the end of the board was reading Wren's account. She read it fully, turned it over to see if there was anything on the back, and then looked up. "Thank you, Miss Holt," she said. Her voice was dry and precise. "You may sit." Wren sat. Garrett's hand found hers under the table. He did not look at her. She did not look at him, but she felt the warmth of it, the rough, deliberate pressure of a man who had decided to do a thing and was doing it. And she held it and let it steady her while the board conferred. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Wren and Garrett sat at their table and did not speak. Clem sat at his table with his representative and also did not speak, though Wren could see, from the angle at which she was sitting, that his ease had not returned. He was still and watchful in the way of a man who had expected a door to open, and was now uncertain whether it would. When the board returned, the chair spoke briefly and without ceremony. The evidence presented indicated a clear pattern of fraudulent record-keeping. The original land contract remained the governing document. The authority notice was rescinded. The restrictions on the ranch's operations were lifted, effective immediately. The matter of the fraudulent records would be referred for further examination. Clem Rourke left the room without looking at either of them. Wren sat for a moment after the room began to clear. She sat and breathed and let the outcome arrive properly. the way outcomes needed to arrive, not all at once, but in stages, the way light returned after a long darkness, gradually, and from the edges. Garrett was still beside her. His hand was still over hers. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she agreed. They were outside on the steps of the building before either of them said anything else. The afternoon had come on while they were inside, the sun lower now but still present, casting long shadows across the wide road. The air was cold and clear and smelled of horses and dust and the particular cleanness of autumn. Garrett stood beside her on the steps. He was looking at the road with the expression she had learned to read, not the nothing expression she had first taken it for, but the full one, the one that held more than it showed. "You presented your own past to a room full of strangers," he said. "Yes." "Before he could use it against you. It seemed more efficient." He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, not new exactly, but more present than it had been. The look of a man who has stopped standing at the edge of something and stepped into it. Wren. He said her name the way he had been saying it for weeks, as attention, as care, as the particular weight of a person who had come to mean something and was no longer trying to pretend otherwise. "I don't know how to do this well. I did it once and I didn't do it as well as she deserved. And I have spent 4 years knowing that." He paused. "But I know that I don't want you to leave. And I know that's not the same as asking you to stay. And I know the difference matters." Wren looked at him in the autumn light, at the face that had become readable to her the way the land around the ranch had become readable. Not because it had changed, but because she had learned it. "Ask me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Stay. Not because of the contract or because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because you want to. Because Della is going to keep getting into things she shouldn't, and someone sensible needs to be there. And because the north pasture fence still isn't right. And because—" He stopped. He started again, more quietly. "Because I have been waiting to want something for 4 years, and I would rather not wait any longer." She looked at him for a long moment, at the hills beyond the settlement, holding their autumn color against the pale sky, at the road that led back to the ranch, 2 days in that direction, where a 7-year-old girl was almost certainly negotiating for a second cat. "I already unpacked," she said. Something moved in his face. The same movement she had seen once before, the short exhale that was almost laughter. Then it became actual laughter, quiet and unpracticed and entirely real. The laugh of a man who had forgotten he knew how to do it and was remembering. She laughed too. It came out easier than she expected. They rode back the following morning, and the road was the same road it had been 2 days earlier, but felt different under it, lighter somehow, or perhaps not lighter, but more settled, the way things felt when they had found the place they belonged. When they came through the gate of the ranch in the late afternoon of the second day, Della was already there. Alderman had apparently brought her back that morning, correctly anticipating that the matter would be resolved, and that Della would want to be home. She was sitting on the porch steps with the tabby cat in her lap, and a proprietary air that suggested she had been managing the property in their absence, and found it satisfactory. She looked at them. She looked at Garrett, then at Wren, with the clear-eyed assessment that missed very little. "Did you fix it?" she asked. "We fixed it," Garrett said, swinging down from his horse. Della appeared to receive this with the measured acceptance of someone who had expected nothing less but was relieved nonetheless. She stood, dislodging the cat, and went into the house, and after a moment called back through the open door, "There's leftover biscuits from this morning. Mrs. Alderman sent them." Garrett looked at Wren. She looked at him. They brought the horses to the barn and saw to them properly, working side by side in the comfortable near silence of people who had learned each other's rhythms, and when they came into the kitchen, the lamp was lit and the biscuits were on the table. And Della was already seated with the expectant practicality of a child who understood that supper needed to happen regardless of what else had happened that day. Wren hung her coat on the hook by the door, not the hook at the far end that had always been empty, but the one beside Garrett's, the one that had been available all along and that she had not used until now. She sat down. Garrett poured coffee. Della passed the biscuits. The lamp burned steadily in the center of the table, throwing its warm light across 3 faces, and outside the kitchen window, the ranch settled into its evening. The last light leaving the hills, the animals quiet in the barn, the fence lines holding against the coming dark. Later, after Della was asleep, Wren went to her room and took the small leather satchel and set it on the bed and opened it. The documents were still inside. All of it. The copies of the ledger entries and May's notebook pages, and the account she had written of her own circumstances, laid bare before strangers in a room full of pale autumn light. She took the account out. She looked at it for a moment, at her own handwriting, the plain recounting of where she had come from and what had been taken, and what she had done about it, and what she had not been able to do. She folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box on the shelf. The box that had held May's letters, May's evidence, May's words. The box that Della had carried in from the storeroom with dirt on her knees and called by the smell of beeswax and dried lavender. There was room enough in it. She put the latch down and stepped back and looked at the box sitting on the shelf in the lamplight, holding everything it held, the past and the evidence and the woman who had written the warning and the woman who had answered it, and felt, with a clarity that was not dramatic and did not announce itself, that she was not leaving. Not tomorrow. Not when it got difficult again, and it would get difficult again, because that was the nature of things worth keeping. Not when the fence needed work or the accounts needed balancing or a child got sick in the night and there was no one else to sit with her. She was staying. She had chosen it. The choosing had been done a long time ago, she understood now. Not in the room before the board, not on the steps of the authority building, not even at the kitchen table when she told Garrett to stop making it easy for her to leave. The choosing had been done on the first night, when she had heard a child cough in a dark house and taken off her coat before she knew anything else about the place at all. Everything since had just been the proof of it. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark, and through the thin wall of the house she could hear the ordinary sounds of the night, the wind moving across the land, the creak of the barn in the cold, the distant sound of an animal settling. And underneath all of it, quieter than any of those sounds, the particular silence of a house that held more than one person sleeping without fear. She closed her eyes. Outside, the stars were out in their full number, cold and clear and indifferent and beautiful, burning above a ranch that was still standing, above a land that was still held, above 2 people who had come to each other sideways, through necessity and accident and the particular grace of a child asking a simple question and a woman deciding, at last, to answer it honestly. The dark held them. The night moved on. And somewhere in the house, in a small room off the kitchen, Della slept with the tabby cat curled at her feet, dreaming whatever children dreamed when they finally believed that morning would come, and the people they needed would still be there when it did.